I think Josh Paunil learns something new about us two every single week he comes on. What's happening, Josh?
Enjoy listening, seeing what you guys like and don't like. AKA Mike is a great person to go out to eat with. PT, I love you, but I'm not sure if we're going out to eat anytime soon, man.
What are you talking about? Haven't you seen my size? You're saying I'm going to steal your portion? No, I'm going to take you to the best steakhouse in town.
Very territorial on that steak he is. Josh, a lot to dive into, I think, this week. In a game where, realistically, I think Doug Pederson has told us, like, hey, we're looking ahead to the future here. This game on the road, just for this team, he's talked about a young team and having a lot of young players. Finding a way to win a road game with this group is another step in a direction. People talking about, Doug and this team and the lack of weapons. They have a chance to get to 500 this late into December. That's something I think gets overlooked a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, it's a very tough road for the Eagles to make the playoffs at this point. But right now, they're still, like a game and a half behind Washington. So obviously the season, especially, losing 6 out of your last 8, it hasn't gone how you want it to have gone. But, the season's far from over. I mean, I think that was part of Doug's message was we still got things to play with, but that got overshadowed when he was also talking about, we want to build for the future, want to build through free agency and the draft. So it's kind of I don't want to say mixed message because obviously it's different. It's different what he's telling us than what he's telling the players. But it's definitely been, even though we've been talking a lot about the future, there's still a lot of football left to be played this season.
Okay, now bear with me a little, and I just wrote this article about this, so I'll try to shorten the version here. Yesterday he says we played a lot of young guys, and he mentions Vaitai. And this is what makes me angry a little bit, because I was one of the proponents of playing Barber at right tackle and Wisniewski at left guard. At that time, that team's 3-1. You're a team that's in it. You're there. You're okay. We're 3-1. This season means something. He elected to play a rookie. That was his decision, was it not? So I kind of look back to that decision and him kind of saying, well, we're playing a lot of young guys. Well, you chose that. You could have played 2 veteran guys. You chose to play a rookie on the road in a division rival's building. And let's be honest. Let's say they lose every other game but win that game. A 6-5 team with a win over the Redskins sounds a whole heck of a lot different than a 5-6 team losing that game. And that game was really one where a young player that he chose to play possibly caused that game to be a loss.
Yeah, and that's one thing that you've seen from Doug in the last few days is kind of trying to shift the narrative to, now what he's saying he's really going to emphasize and evaluate guys based off is their effort. And, we asked, because he said multiple times, the season's headed in the right direction. And we quite simply asked, well, why do you think that? And he said, well, the effort's still there. That hasn't been a problem. And I think it's very telling that his standard now has become, what's the effort? Not are we winning, not, this or that, but the effort is something he constantly preaches. And obviously that's important, but that shouldn't be something you evaluate based on. That should be kind of like an expectation that is a given and that you expect more out of your players than just effort. But as you said, definitely changing the narrative the last few days. And he made these decisions. That was part of the problem heading into the season with drafting Carson Wentz, keeping Sam Bradford. You had these 2 competing methodologies that the Eagles were doing. They kept saying, and they honestly, were working toward trying to make the playoffs this season while also building ahead for the future and, drafting Wentz. And that's a very fine line to walk. And you trade Bradford, so maybe you think, okay, well, now they'll just build for the future with a rookie quarterback and a rookie head coach. But then you win the first 3 games. And so I don't think that is a juggling act that Doug Pederson and Howie Roseman and the Eagles handled perfectly. I think they could have done a better job with it. As you mentioned, playing Barber at right tackle and Wisniewski at left guard, or even saying Malo at left guard. Obviously he was hurt, but he actually looked, he was rough around the edges because it was, his first major NFL action, but he didn't look too bad at right guard this past week. So it's a lot of kind of competing things that have been going on in terms of what the Eagles say they want to do and what they're trying to get out of the season.
Josh, people have said that Lane Johnson's suspension was a tipping point of the season. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Because not only do you have, obviously, that poor performance by Vaitai in Washington, but it also is just it affects your game plan and what you can do. When you have, even for Carson Wentz, when you know you have a guy at right tackle, nothing's going to get by him. You don't have to worry about it. If the blitz is coming, if pressure's coming, you know that you can count on Lane Johnson and he'll be fine. You can take those longer drops. Doug Pederson can dial up those plays down the field. But when you have Vaitai, even if he is progressing, even if he is kind of holding his own most of the time, you're still giving him help. You're still maybe shortening Carson Wentz's drop. You're limiting what you can do offensively. So obviously that's not the only reason. That may not even be the biggest reason for their 5-6 record, but it's definitely a significant part of why they are where they are.
Talking with Josh Paunil, PhillyMag.com. Birds 24/7, looking at the Eagles as they get ready for the Bengals team. They're never won in Cincinnati, by the way, and they haven't played very well on the road this year. But
they've tied.
Yeah, one of the things that has been a big conversation is, all the youth that they have been playing and the young guys. And we keep forgetting that even a guy like Nelson Aguilar is a young player. I mean, he's a second-year player. He got benched last week. Frank Reich was asked today, how that affected things, and he kind of gave well, he runs great routes. And his answer was but what have you seen in that whole situation as we've now matured? Is it apparent that he's going to play? I mean, what did we learn in the last week about this whole Aguilar thing? Was it more for optics just to say they did something?
Well, a couple of thoughts on that. There isn't much clarity this week in terms of whether he's going to play. I really don't think Doug knows. I think that's a decision. Maybe he comes out and says it tomorrow, but it could be a decision, I think, that doesn't happen until maybe even the weekend of whether Nelson Aguilar will again be benched. Because he said, I believe it was on Monday, about Paul Turner that the next few weeks could be significant for him. And to me, that suggests that guy might be playing, not just this week, but maybe the following week. So maybe it's Turner instead of Aguilar, maybe it's both of them and they activate 5 receivers. So there isn't much clarity at all in terms of whether Nelson Aguilar will play. But as for what we learned is that there's a reason Paul Turner and Bryce Treggs were undrafted free agents who were on the practice squad or weren't activated for almost the entire season. They struggle to get open. There's really not much they bring to the team, and that's why if I was Doug Pederson, I would be inclined to play Nelson Aguilar because even though, maybe he drops a pass or something happens where he doesn't have a positive impact on the team, he has some skill level and he has something that he could contribute. If you could, try to fix the mental issues, he's still a capable NFL player. But Paul Turner and Bryce Treggs, it's very unlikely they have a future with this team. So try to get what you can out of Nelson Aguilar. It's not like you would play him over other receivers who are very good. There has been some clarity in terms of the lack of talent, or I guess crystallize that because we already knew that, but there's still a lot of things that aren't clear because we don't know how Doug Pederson will manage Nelson Aguilar going forward.
Josh, what Mike and I are still scratching our heads about is if they sit Aguilar, then why not put anything in the game plan for the guys who replaced him? And then why open the game, like, for example, with DGB getting a ton of action, but then get away from that for the rest of the game? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, well, what Doug Pederson said, I believe it was on Monday, or not Monday, Tuesday, was that, they had plays in for Paul Turner, the game plan, but for whatever reason, they just didn't get to him. And, perhaps part of that is because, DGB obviously had that big first drive, had a season-high yardage total, like 75, 80, somewhere around there. Maybe they just wanted to feed the hot hand or get the ball to him because he was their best receiver on the field. But I think the biggest thing is they just saw these guys really just aren't getting open. I mean, Bryce Tregg, one thing you see a lot with him is, that first big play he had, his first game they debuted in when he had that big catch. Obviously, that
Giants.
Really got. Yeah, thank you. The Giants game that kind of gave people a jolt, but that's really all he brings, and so teams are kind of sitting on that now, taking that away. So you're not going to see many opportunities for him. Like the Seattle game was a perfect example when Carson forced that interception. on the shadow of his goal line and into double coverage against Richard Sherman and Earl Thomas. And so you have these guys not getting open. Even though they have plays in the game plan, I think they just didn't prioritize them because they thought, well, from what we've seen, these guys can't get open, so let's try to go somewhere else like Doriel.
Yeah, and, Beckham came out, caught the ball, got some separation, made some tough catches. You're scratching your head, like Pete said, as to, wow, they had something going there. You're a limited offense. Keep going with something that you do well until they stop you, and then you make your adjustments. And it was like that first drive, and they had it going in that first drive against Seattle, too, and never really got back to things. It is a little puzzling when you get at the end of these games thinking, man, you had something going. Why'd you get out of what you were doing? And then moving forward here, like Pete said, you got guys that are undrafted. They might, maybe they have a skill that you can utilize. And I say this, I've been saying this all week long, Josh, about there's a lot of receivers in this league that no one's ever heard of, and they're going out there, coming into the league. Tyreek Hill was not a guy on the radar. Jamison Crowder was not someone that was like, man, this guy's going to be great. These teams game plan and utilize those guys to get the most out of their skill set. And it's like, you got this kid Treggs. Why don't you game plan to utilize his skill set, which is speed? Meanwhile, they don't get him the ball in any capacity. It's just a head scratcher.
Yeah, the one thing I will say is, as critical as I've been about the receivers, one thing that really was apparent later in the game was how the lack of pass protection that Carson Wentz had, the lack of time. He missed several opportunities. I don't want to say necessarily big plays down the field, but just intermediate, 15, 20, maybe 10-yard gains. I think the shuffling of the offensive line definitely hurt Carson Wentz's ability to get the ball to those guys. Even though Paul Turner, Bryce Treggs didn't get open much, Dorial Green-Beckham, for example, could have had a much bigger game if Carson Wentz had a little more time. But obviously, when you're playing backups at three different offensive line positions, that time in the pocket's not always going to be there.
Josh, Carson Wentz, those last 8 games, 2-6 record, all the numbers aren't nearly as impressive as they were early in the season. Doug's been asked a lot about it. Frank Reich's been asked about it. What are you seeing out of Carson Wentz right now? Is this rookie fatigue? Is this the fact that teams are getting overwhelmed? He doesn't have anybody to throw to. What's the biggest problems you're seeing with Carson Wentz right now?
I mean, I know it's kind of been just hammered over and over again, but it really is just the lack of weapons. I think the mistakes that you're seeing from him are on mechanical things, footwork things. Doug Pederson, I think, is really looking forward to trying to work more on in the next offseason. But a lot of the mistakes Carson Wentz are making.
It sounds like we lost Josh there, and we'll try to pull him back on because he was talking some good stuff about Carson Wentz, where, Carson's in this little spot, as you mentioned. What are the numbers over the last 8 games?
He's 2-6. He's at a 63.1 completion percentage, 228 yards a game. Now, these are the big ones. Only 6 touchdowns, but 8 interceptions. His interception numbers in the last couple games, Mike, have gone up, and he's got a quarterback rating over the last 8 games of 76.3. If the learning curve is the word that you're going to use, well, he came out way high. I mean, he was way above the curve in those first couple of games, and everybody thought, woo, this is Carson Wentz. We're going to tear it up.
And same weapons.
Yeah, same weapons. And now we're at this point in the season, and well, it's been a rough go for Carson Wentz. He does not get a pass of everybody. It's been a rough go for him. Josh Paunil back on the line with us. We were talking about Carson Wentz, and I just gave some of his numbers there, Josh, that he's 2-6 over the last 8 games, completion percentage of 63%, and touchdowns to interceptions jump out at me. 6 touchdowns, 8 interceptions.
Yeah, and that's one thing that with the interceptions you're seeing, just the decision-making, but also just sailing the ball. And that's something you've seen, I would say, in the majority of interceptions recently is there's a little bit of pressure in his face, so he throws the ball off his back foot. Now, it's, obviously not to make an excuse. You shouldn't, even when you have a little bit of pressure in your face, you shouldn't throw the ball 6 feet over Zach Ertz's head as he did against the Packers on Monday Night Football. But the one thing that really stands out on this film, I want to say in every game this season, has been he makes plays that not a lot of guys can make. The arm that he has is special, the pocket mobility, and just a lot of the things that you can't really teach. I mean, just kind of feeling where the pressure is coming from things of that nature. So even though the numbers haven't been very good, obviously the win-loss record, the most important thing, hasn't been very good. There's still a lot of encouraging signs about Carson Wentz and where he's heading going forward.
Yeah, Josh, and we'll flip things over to defense today because Jim Schwartz, he was kind of pushed today about not talking. He basically said, I do what I'm required to do, but I do take accountability. This is my defense. I'm the defensive coordinator. He basically admitted there's not a lot of communication between him and Pederson regarding defense. He does what he does. I'm in charge of the defense here. But what did you learn today about Jim Schwartz and this defense in terms of where he feels that they need to get better?
The biggest thing really is just being able to counteract quarterbacks who are trying to get the ball out of their hands as quickly as possible, because that's something that you've seen, obviously, with Aaron Rodgers. Russell Wilson held the ball sometimes, obviously, to get outside the pocket and escape the pressure. But Eli Manning getting the ball out of his hands very quickly. And that's something that teams have started to really focus on, because they look at this defensive line and say, okay, well, these guys are pretty good at getting pressure. Their cornerbacks, on the other hand, are not very good. So we'll try to get the ball out of our hands, get it to receivers on the edge, get 5-7 yard easy gains. And that's something the Eagles haven't countered very well. You look at the sack numbers, and naturally you think, well, the defensive line isn't getting there. Honestly, a big problem is the coverage, because when Aaron Rodgers, so he got the ball out of his hands in less than 2.5 seconds on average on Monday night, which is by far the quickest he has all season, and that's because he could constantly target his receivers on the outside against these corners who were either playing off or just weren't playing very good technique. So that was a big problem. It's not really, when you look at sack numbers, don't just focus on the defensive line, but focus on the cornerbacks, because when the Packers were able to put together those long drives, a lot of it was because not just they couldn't get off the field on third down, but they were giving up those easy short gains down after down.
Josh, Mike and I watched the game together, and so I was able to lean over to him and say, what did you think of that? But at the same time, we also both were constantly tweeting and monitoring Twitter during the game, and a lot of criticism came up about Fletcher Cox. Is that criticism fair and warranted?
Honestly, I think a lot of it's overblown, and for several reasons. Just if you look at this Packers game, first of all, he was double-teamed on the majority of snaps. And I understand when you pay a guy $100 million and you give him, $63 million guaranteed, you have high expectations. You want to see those sack numbers. But if you look at his sack numbers, he has one less sack than Brandon Graham does. And I think we can all agree how well Brandon Graham has played. And as a defensive end, he should get more sacks than an interior guy. Fletcher Cox ranks third among defensive tackles in pressures. So he's also just forcing the quarterback out of the pocket. But the amount of double teams he's facing, he was triple teamed a couple of times against the Packers. I think a lot of it has to do with the lack of production they're getting from the right defensive end. Connor Barwin, Vinny Curry, he hasn't been playing too much, so I don't want to criticize him too much. But in the playing time that he has had, he hasn't wowed you very much. So I really don't think it's a matter of Fletcher Cox. Although I don't think he's played up to his contract, he's playing at a Pro Bowl level. He's very, very good against the run and against the pass. Even though he's not getting huge sack numbers, defensive tackles don't get that many sacks. And especially against the Packers, there were numerous instances where he, just disrupted the play, led the quarterback, the ball carrier into the hands of someone else, forced Rodgers out of the pocket. And then there are a lot of instances, as I mentioned before, with how quickly Rodgers got the ball out of his hands. Fletcher Cox did a great job coming off the ball and just really moving the right guard out of the way, but Rodgers got rid of the ball before he could do anything.
Yeah, and Schwartz brought this up today because he was asked about the production schematically with Fletcher Cox, and he kind of said, I'm not worried about one guy's production. How do we get better? When other guys do better because that guy's getting triple teamed. So don't worry about him. Worry about the fact that he's getting triple teamed. That means somebody else is getting one-on-one, and they're not getting the job done.
Exactly. I think that's one thing that was unique about this game that we haven't seen in other games. Fletcher Cox got a ton of attention. As we touched on, he was triple teamed a couple times even. But Brandon Graham, he's played extremely well this season. Should not just be a Pro Bowler, but should probably be an all-pro defensive end. Brian Bulaga, though, the Packers right tackle, he's very good, and he had a very good game against Brandon Graham. And so even though the Packers chipped Brandon Graham from time to time, they really left him in a lot of one-on-one situations and put all the focus and all the extra blockers on Fletcher Cox. So you had Brandon Graham not winning his one-on-ones, which is pretty unusual. And, for one game, you'll give a guy a pass because of how well he's played this season. But on the other side, Connor Barwin, I mean, how many one-on-ones does he have to get and not win until we talk about that? Because if you want to talk about guys who aren't playing up to their contract or guys who need to be better on the defensive line, Connor Barwin is number one on my list, not Fletcher Cox or anyone else. And so when you get that much attention on Fletcher Cox, the other guys have to step up. When you have a one-on-one in the NFL, you have to take advantage of it, especially as a defensive end on a passing down. But the Eagles, not just in Green Bay, but also recently, just haven't taken advantage of that.
Yeah, Josh, and of course, the Eagles need to take advantage of anything they can the rest of this year. If they get a win this week on the road, they would get to 6-6, and then it gets interesting because they do play Washington again. If they can beat Washington, and all of a sudden you're 7-6, you just close the gap on Washington. You would have another game on the road. So these next 3 weeks could really, just like they were 3-0, the next 3 weeks could really change some things really quickly for this team. What's the vibe going into Cincinnati?
Well, honestly, I think the vibe is I think the guys have relaxed a little bit because I really think they put a lot of pressure on themselves heading into this Packers game. I mean, you could just sense being in the locker room. When I walked in that locker room, in the first 60 seconds, I immediately thought, I don't remember the locker room feeling like this once last season. Even after the Eagles gave up 45 points in back-to-back games, it was more, just embarrassment and upset. But that locker room after that loss, I don't know if hopeless is the right word, but you could tell how just down they were because they really felt like they needed the game. And I think they'll put a lot of pressure on themselves to win that game. And so I'm really curious to see, against Cincinnati, do they come out and say, okay, well, now we can play more relaxed and just go out there and play our game? Or is it going to be, go the opposite way? I don't want to say give up, but, just kind of tail off the rest of the season. And that's something that the veterans on the team and the coaches are obviously trying to prevent. But that'll be very telling as to kind of what kind of coach Doug Pederson is. How does this team finish the season? Do they finish strong, or do they kind of just tail off and just, let things get even worse? And that will be a pretty good sign of what Doug Peterson's future should be in Philadelphia.
He's got 5 more games left here to be evaluated. Let's see what he does with them. Josh Paunil, PhillyMag.com, Birds 24/7. Josh, take care, pal.
Thanks for having me, guys.